This is not the view you want when navigating the Suez Canal. A giant container ship wedged from bank to bank, blocking one of the world's most important shipping lanes. The 400-metre-long Ever Given got stuck on Tuesday morning, running aground in high winds, reportedly after a power failure on board. A fleet of tugboats has been trying to refloat the megaship ever since, while a digger, tiny by comparison, tries to extricate her bow from the eastern bank.
They would be trying to remove anything that is easy to remove. But the location where they're stuck is actually quite, it's not near a port. It is actually quite a distance away from anything. And this is where the clear option is lots and lots of tugboats and digging around the side.
12% of global trade passes through the canal in Egypt between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, goods passing between Europe and Asia without having to round Africa. The Ever Given's mishap temporarily closed a route that's used by 50 large ships every day. With the canal blocked, scores of vessels were left waiting in maritime traffic jams at either end. This was the picture at 1600 hours GMT on Wednesday. As tankers queued, oil prices rose. The blockage another blow to global trade, disrupted by COVID.
Millions of tons of oil, millions of tons of manufactured goods, millions of containers, hundreds of thousands of containers are going through the canal in any given week. And so a prolonged closure would mean that there would be ships stacking up both in the Mediterranean and in the Red Sea, and essentially at anchor, riding at anchor, waiting for the canal to open.
As we saw last week, transportation has rapidly evolved over the past century. While urban transport has significantly altered the landscape of our cities, pushing further and further out the boundaries of developed land, the land consumed by infrastructure necessary for the movement of freight has also had a strong impact on urban development. There are ways we divide, from a broad perspective, the different transportation modes. Those include surface, which covers everything that moves on land or below it; marine, which is everything that floats on water and all of the infrastructure that supports it; and air, which is everything that flies. Today, we'll focus on a single mode: marine. Marine transport, or sea freight, is the most widely used mode of transportation for international trade. Almost 90% of trade is done by sea freight. An advantage of sea freight is that it is very cheap to deliver very large quantities of goods over really long distances. There are many pros and cons associated with the use of sea freight. Similar to other modes of transportation, sea freight has advantages and disadvantages. It is economical, however, it is slow. It can easily handle a large loading capacity, but it requires trans-shipping at ports, that is, recontainerization or movement once it gets to a port. It's cheap, however, there is a higher theft risk involved with storage and movement at ports. Long-distance journeys are easily feasible, however, it is not as flexible as other modes can be. It's perfect for bulky, heavy-lift, oversized cargo, but it has limited reliability, which is heavily dependent on weather. It also has a fixed timetable and arrival and departure, so it is highly reliable in that sense. However, it has long transportation times. It has a worldwide transportation network. However, movement on this network needs to be carefully orchestrated, and goods need to be very solidly packed, and normally many handlings are required to safely transport goods in this manner. There are a number of impacts associated with sea freight. One of them is environmental impacts. So far, we've talked about the pros and cons of sea freight. However, the environmental impacts can be significant, and there's a lot of issues associated with both the movement of freight by ocean and the development of ports. One major issue is contamination of local waters from goods themselves and from runoff from the ship. This is something that has been increasingly stressful to local environments as they deal with ships circumnavigating the globe. Since civilization has become seafaring, we have brought with them, either purposefully or unintentionally, animals and microbes that invade new territory. Controlling the threat of invasive species stowing away in cargo or somewhere else on the vessel is a daily battle for New Zealand, a battle that has not always been won.
Recently, New Zealanders have been spending their free time doing something unusual. They're trapping rats. It's a common pastime. Rats are an invasive predator in New Zealand, so the country's come up with an ambitious plan to kill them. All of them. But could this ever possibly work?
The rats that were introduced to New Zealand are just the rats that we're all familiar with. They have extraordinary senses of smell, of touch. They are incredibly resourceful, which is partly why they're a problem.
Rats were first introduced into the country in the 13th century when they hitched rides on voyaging canoes. Before then, the only mammals on the island were tiny finger-sized bats.
Rats are prolific, they breed easily, they get everywhere, they're very hard to get rid of once they're in a place.
Invasive predators, like rats, are a nuisance everywhere. But in New Zealand, they're causing an ecological disaster.
Islands worldwide tend to be hotbeds of evolution because the animals and plants that find themselves on islands are separated off from relatives on the mainland and so evolve in their own weird and wonderful ways. The bird life in New Zealand became incredibly diverse. They are also, because of their history, exquisitely vulnerable. They are, many of them, flightless, which means it's very hard for them to escape or to run away.
Remember, these birds evolved without mammalian predators. Many of them don't exist anywhere else in the world. Now they're easy prey for hungry rodents.
They have wiped out around a quarter of New Zealand's native bird species. The worry is that if the rat problem is not addressed, many more of these unique species are going to go extinct.
With the fate of rare birds like the kiwi and the kakapo at stake, New Zealand is enacting a radical new plan called Predator Free 2050.
We want to create a new New Zealand, a safe, predator-free sanctuary for our native birds and animals.
Predator Free 2050 is New Zealand's ambitious goal to rid the entire country of introduced mammalian predators, rats, ferrets and possums.
Currently, New Zealand's predator-free approach consists of using pesticides and encouraging citizen trapping, but they have a lot of ground to cover.
The largest success story ever for rat eradication has been Macquarie Island in Australia, which is 50 square miles. Now, New Zealand is 2,000 times that size. It's huge. The idea of doing that across an entire country still just seems like such a monumental task. You need to be dropping poisons about the place. You need to be scouring acres of land looking for signs of rats.
In addition to these grassroots measures, they're considering a revolutionary new technique.
A technique for editing DNA. CRISPR combines with a technology called gene drives.
Gene drives are still in the experimental stage. In simple terms, the technology implants a specific gene into one generation and ensures its rapid spread.
You could imagine, for example, spreading a gene through populations of mosquitoes to make them sterile, or, in this case, through populations of rats to make them infertile.
If this strategy succeeds, it could be applied in other ecosystems and help endangered species rebound around the world. But it's incredibly risky.
The worry is that gene drives are so good at spreading genes across wild populations that it would then be very easy for it to spread beyond New Zealand's borders to other parts of the world. What happens if you wipe out rats from everywhere in the world? Entire food webs might collapse.
But a New Zealand without rats could allow its unique birds to thrive again.
You get to hear birdsong in places that are currently silent. Species that were on the brink of extinction come back.
Near New Zealand's capital city, there's 500 acres that are already cause for hope.
It's called Zealandia. It's this huge nature reserve built this incredible predator-proof fence around. And they've introduced a ton of birds. And you can walk around and you hear the sounds of all these birds. It gives you a very audible sense of how much the country has lost and how much it stands to gain.
While strides in conservation have been made, there's more work to be done before CRISPR comes into play. The plan will need political support and a lot of funding to develop technology to do what's never been done before. Until then, rat trapping will remain a popular pastime.
Other environmental threats from the movement of freight by sea include sedimentation, modification of water currents, modification via reclamation, noise, amenity and visual effects, hazards, and water quality issues. To illustrate the importance of sea freight, each year, more than 11 billion tons of goods is carried around the world on large freighters. This includes most things you use on a daily basis, from grains to oil to cars and TVs. All of these things are moved from port to port, facilitating the global economy. This dependence on marine freight and the benefits it brings to the economy are not without their downsides. Marine transport accounts for approximately 4% of climate-changing greenhouse gas emissions. Despite the drawbacks of marine freight, and in particular the impacts of port infrastructure on our environment, ports continue to be an important component to our cities. Auckland is a good example of a city whose port provides a critical economic link to the rest of the world. Ports have an enormous impact on land. They consume vast swaths of land, often prime real estate near CBDs, and, in some cases, require significant earthworks in the form of land reclamation. This reclamation process and the need to alter the seabed to carve out deeper channels to accommodate the ever-growing size of freighters can have a significant impact on the local environment. On the land side, the ports themselves need links to larger transportation networks. This can include roads to the highway system and spur lines to the rail trunk lines. All of this has significant noise and visual impact on the surrounding land uses. Marine development and ports are really important to New Zealand. The country's location in the world means that New Zealand must rely on an effective and realizable port system to enable the import and export of goods. So, just how reliant on ports is New Zealand? Nearly 99% of New Zealand's exports are transported by sea, with over 31 million tons of exported goods and 19 million tons of imported goods passing through the country's ports. 6 ports handle nearly 90% of the country's seabound imports and exports. There are many environmental policies related to ports. One of those are regional coastal plans. These are plans prepared by regional councils and regional authorities for the coastal marine area of the region to assist the regional council in achieving the sustainable management of their coastal environment. New Zealand coastal policy statements also have an impact on ports, and their purpose is to set policies in order to achieve the purpose of the RMA in relation to the coastal environment of New Zealand. The ports of Auckland have a long history. The Port of Auckland started to take shape in the way we see it today, starting in 1982. In 1982, Onehunga Port started to handle containers. Another 16 years passed before the Ports of Auckland is officially formed, with the purchase of the Auckland Harbour Board's land assets for about $250 million, which is about $500 million in today's New Zealand dollars. The port was upgraded between 2001 and 2006 with new container cranes and other equipment. In 2006, the port was removed from the share market to become wholly owned by the Auckland Council. In 2007, the The port lands at the Western Reclamation were transferred to the Waterfront Development Agency. Since 2006, the port has been held by Auckland Council. There are a number of benefits with this holding structure. The Auckland Council earns dividends from the port to the tune of nearly $70 million per year. The port also directly employs 500 people and supports another 187,000 jobs indirectly. The port, at least in pre-COVID days, handled over 100 cruise ships a year, each of which contributed $1.5 million per visit to the regional economy. For better or worse, more than 250,000 cars per year are imported through the port, and 968,741 TEUs, that's 20-foot equivalent containers, plus over 5 million tons of bulk freight are handled at the port each year.